Okay, thank you. Welcome to the press conference with the Honorable Marci, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, the Honorable Marco Mendicino, Minister of Public Safety, the Honorable Fraser, Minister of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship, and the Honorable David Lametti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Go ahead, Marci.
Bonjour. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Marci, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, and I'm joining you from Berlin, Germany, where I am attending the G7 Gender Equality Ministers meeting. Over these last couple of weeks, the world has witnessed the Iranian regime killing, injuring, and attacking its own citizens for simply standing up for their own human rights. After the killing of Mahsa Amini, Iranian women, both young and old, and allied men and boys from cities across the country have taken to the streets to say enough is enough. These brave women are not only fighting for their rights and freedoms, they are fighting for a better future for their daughters, their sisters, their aunts, their mothers, making sure that the next generation does not have to suffer through these same injustices. We've all heard and seen how these protests are unlike any others. We're seeing schoolgirls risk everything. We're seeing older people that can't necessarily march, but still want to support. And they're supporting protesters by giving them meals, by giving them water. What we're seeing is an intergenerational movement for hope. Last week, Canada introduced sanctions against the so-called morality police and its leadership. And today, Minister Joly announced further sanctions against the 20 individuals and entities that have been complicit in the Iranian regime's human rights violations and the disinformation campaigns that seek to justify them. She's also working to rally the international community in support of Iranian women and their fight. In the coming weeks, Minister Joly will bring together a group of women foreign ministers from across the globe to discuss the ways to do just that. And I'm proud to be here at the G7 Gender Equality Ministers meeting in Berlin to, of course, discuss gender equality. And I will be raising vigorously the issue of Iran's human rights violations at every opportunity that I can, emphasizing that we must all push back against this oppression. We will continue standing in solidarity with the women of Iran and the Canadian Iranian community, and with the millions of people around the world who are demanding change. And there are millions of them. And I want to make this very, very clear that this is not about headscarves and whether or not they should or should not be worn in public. This is about respecting a woman's right to self-determine her own path. Self-determine her own path. This is about women and people of Iran that are demanding change from leaders that refuse to respect its citizens' basic human rights. Canada will continue standing in solidarity with Iranian women and girls because, frankly, too many lives have been cut short, injustices inflicted, and dreams destroyed. Thank you very much. Merci. To speak more about the measures that we've announced, I now hand things over to Minister Mendicino.
Thank you, Marci. Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that both I and Minister Lametti are joining you today from the traditional Mi'kmaq territory. We're here today because we all agree with a clear, principled, and powerful premise. The Iranian regime must be held accountable for its systemic violation of human rights, for its brutal attacks, torture, and killings, for all of the lives lost in the downing of PS 752, for Mahsa Amini. C'est un régime qui a tué ses propres citoyens. C'est un régime qui a aussi tué nos citoyens. Iran is a violent theocracy that has shown a flagrant disregard for human rights. and a pernicious support for terrorism in the Middle East and beyond. Today and every day, we hold in our hearts the 55 Canadians, 33 permanent residents, and 88 other foreign nationals who were brutally murdered when Flight PS752 was shot out of the sky over 2 years ago. And we renew our demand that Iran fulfill its international legal obligations and ensures transparency and justice for all of its actions. Nous continuons à les soutenir ainsi que tous ceux qui ont perdu des êtres chers dans cette tragédie. Nous sommes également aux côtés des femmes courageuses d'Iran qui font entendre leur voix et exigent un changement. Au cours des dernières semaines, nous avons renforcé les mesures contre le régime iranien qui sont déjà parmi les plus sévères de tous les pays du monde. And today I'm going to expand on the significant sanctions and steps we are taking here in Canada to hold the regime accountable that fall within my portfolio. Firstly, we're ensuring that no one responsible for these egregious human rights violations can ever come to Canada again. Tout d'abord, nous veillons à ce qu'aucune personne responsable de ces violations flagrantes des droits de la personne ne puisse plus jamais venir au Canada. And to accomplish this objective, we're using a powerful and sparingly used provision under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to designate the entirety of the Iranian regime as an entity that is a serial violator of human rights and one that commits acts of terror. Further, we will be designating senior officials of the Iranian regime as inadmissible, including the senior echelons and members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC as is known, and its top leaders. And this could prohibit more than 10,000 officers and senior members who have engaged in terrorism and violated human rights from ever setting foot in Canada again. Designating regimes as inadmissible under IRPA is a tool employed very rarely because it's reserved for the most egregious human rights violations around the world. And in this case, it is clearly fully warranted. Deuxièmement, nous faisons avancer la législation au Parlement qui rendra les personnes visées par les sanctions inadmissibles. Second, we're advancing legislation through Parliament that will render those subject to sanctions as inadmissible. Cela inclut les 25 membres du régime iranien contre lesquels nous avons annoncé des sanctions la semaine dernière et bien d'autres. Plus important encore, cela concerne les hauts dirigeants militaires comme ceux du corps des gardiens de la révolution islamique, de la force Quds et des services de renseignement qui sont directement responsables de la brutalité et des crimes. Finally, we know that sanctions are only as strong as our ability to enforce them. And that's why we're bolstering capacity on the front lines to implement sanctions on the regime and to hold those responsible to account. We're investing $76 million for law enforcement agencies and other personnel so we can enhance our capacity to seize and freeze assets that would otherwise be used to advance the Iranian regime's interests. Nous investissons quelques 76 millions de dollars pour aider nos organismes d'application de la loi à agir rapidement pour saisir des biens, recueillir des preuves, et plus encore. This will significantly increase the RCMP's capacity to investigate, lay charges, and take action against those responsible. This funding will see the addition of up to 30 new RCMP members and public servants who will track the assets of those who are sanctioned and seize them. Beyond our borders, this funding will help Canada crack down on those who would use every effort to evade law enforcement and justice. It will reinforce the RCMP's work to track vessels on the high seas and monitor compliance. Finally, the funding will help the RCMP broaden and deepen its relationship with international partners to ensure that those who are sanctioned have nowhere to hide. And it will also support work by Global Affairs and a variety of other departments and agencies across government. Most importantly, this investment will give Canada the tools that it needs to enforce all of the sanctions we have introduced against Iran, which will allow for the seizure, forfeiture, disposal, and redistribution of assets from those that are sanctioned. Canada is a global leader when it comes to these sanctions, and we will never be a safe haven for anyone who would attempt to use this country as a place where human rights can be violated or to facilitate any act of terror. En conclusion, je tiens à saluer tout ce qui, en Iran, au Canada et dans le monde entier, qui continue d'exiger un changement. Nous sommes avec vous et nous agissons. Canada is using all of our tools at our disposal to hold the regime accountable. And to the women who are protesting in Iran, to those who are protesting here in Canada and around the world, we see you, we hear you, we understand why you are outraged, and we will do everything in our power to hold those responsible and to defend human rights here and around the world. Thank you, merci, and now I will turn it over to Minister Fraser.
Thank you, Minister Mendicino, Minister Ian. It's good to see you both. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. What we're seeing in the face of such unwarranted violence and oppression is some of the most extraordinary examples of courage with women and young people demanding a better future for themselves. And to those who are protesting at risk to their own life and limb, please know that Canada stands alongside you. Je me joins à mes collègues pour appuyer les peuples iraniens qui se soulèvent contre ce régime oppresseur. Last week, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister announced the intent to pursue a designation of the Iranian regime, including the IRGC and its top leaders, under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Minister Mendicino on some of these points, but it's important for folks to understand that this designation is going to capture an extremely broad range of individuals tied to the regime and not just the IRGC. It's going to include senior officials of the regime that will be rendered inadmissible to Canada for their engagement in terror, for systemic and gross human rights violations. Canada contre les corps des gardiens de la Révolution islamique et d'empêcher les personnes sanctionnées de venir au Canada. When these measures are in place, the designation of the Islamic Republic of Iran as a terrorist regime will render all senior officials of that country inadmissible. This includes not only heads of state and military leaders, but also intelligence officials, senior public servants, diplomats, and members of the judiciary. To further strengthen our ability to hold Iran accountable, we have previously tabled changes to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that will allow our sanctions to be more effective from an inadmissibility point of view. These amendments are going to expand the scope for inadmissibility to Canada based on sanctions imposed by country, entity, or person. This is going to help empower Canada to respond to systemic human rights violations, breaches of international peace and security. It's important also to understand that we continue to take action to welcome vulnerable Iranian applicants to Canada through our programs and special measures, including our public policy for human rights defenders and the and families of Flight DS-752. I've had the opportunity, both myself with some of the families on a number of occasions, and we continue to advance measures that are going to support them to make sure that they have the support they need after the tragedy. Le Canada continue de se battre pour obtenir justice pour les victimes du vol de PS 752, 78 personnes ayant de liens avec le Canada, y compris des citoyens, des résidents étudiants tués par le corps des gardiens de la Révolution islamique. Nous continuons aussi de nous battre pour découvrir la vérité et nous demanderons des comptes aux responsables. We've put in place a number of special immigration measures for the victims and their families, including issuing temporary residence visas to family members so they can help after the tragedy. Extending temporary resident status for those who were unable to leave Canada, particularly over the course of the pandemic, and creating a new permanent residency pathway for certain families of victims who were both inside and outside of Canada. Applications for 174 individuals have been received under the In Canada public policy so far. And as of September 29th of this year, 137 have been approved, and 100 are now already permanent residents, with more certainly to come. In recognition of the work that human rights defenders do and to protect human rights around the world, we introduced one of the very first examples of the world of a new dedicated refugee stream for human rights defenders. Canada settles a couple hundred of people each year, including family members who are fleeing persecution in their country of origin annually. This is important to protect people who are vulnerable because of their defense of the basic human rights that we too often take for granted here in Canada. But when it comes to Iranian officials and members of the regime, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada is going to work with Canada Border Services Agency, Public Safety, and all impacted departments to ensure that those who have implemented repressive measures, violated human rights, and spread the Iranian regime's propaganda and misinformation will not be able to use Canada as a refuge or safe haven. I've spoken to members of the Iranian Canadian community in different parts of the country, but here at home as well. They've made it clear that they do not want Canada to be a backyard for bad actors who are part of the Iranian regime. And with the measures that we're describing today, we're going to ensure that we do not allow senior officials within the regime to come to Canada at all. As I said at the outset of my remarks, we are so impressed with the courage of the protesters and the young people and the women who are taking to the streets in the aggressive Iranian regime. And I want you to know that we're watching and we are doing what we can to support you. I'm pleased to turn it over to my colleague, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada, Minister Lametti. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Sean. Hello.
Thank you, Sean.
Bonjour. J'ai le plaisir de me joindre à mes collègues ici cet après-midi du territoire traditionnel des Mi'kmaq pour expliquer plus en détail les mesures importantes que notre gouvernement prend à l'encontre du régime iranien. Nos actions seront efficaces et percutantes. Elles sont le meilleur moyen de riposter aux incroyables violations de droits de la personne commises par le régime iranien. Grâce à ces mesures, le Canada se tient aux côtés de tous les Iraniens, plus particulièrement des femmes courageuses qui se battent pour leurs droits fondamentaux de la personne. In Canada, we have a full suite of measures to protect our country and keep Canadians safe from threats, including threats posed by terrorism and violent extremism. One of those tools is the terrorist listing regime in the Criminal Code. I know that some have suggested we list the IRGC. I'm here to tell you that the path we have chosen is better at targeting the Iranian regime and better at keeping Canadians safe. We are targeting the most reprehensible members of the IRGC and the Iranian regime, their senior leaders. We are also making sure that we don't hurt ordinary Iranians and Iranian Canadians who are fighting the regime or fleeing its human rights abuses. Canada has taken several strong steps to address the terrorist activity sponsored by and committed by the IRGC. Iran is designated as a state supporter of terrorism under the State Immunity Act. We have listed the IRGC's Quds Force as a terrorist entity. And we have also listed several terrorist groups that are supported by IRGC Quds Force, including Hezbollah and Hamas. In June 2019, Canada added 3 new Iran-backed groups to the Criminal Code list: the Al-Ashtar Brigades, Harakat al-Sabirin, and Fatamayun Division. We use the Criminal Code terrorist listing when it is the best tool to target and isolate a terrorist group. But the terrorist listing provisions of the Criminal Code are a blunt instrument. Sometimes they do not give us the precision we need to target the truly bad actors without catching innocent people as well. The IRGC is part of Iran's military. Military service is mandatory for many Iranians, including those who do not support the regime. There are Iranians who left the country to move to Canada and have served in the IRGC. What does this mean, practically speaking? L'ajout du corps des gardiens de la Révolution islamique sur la liste des groupes terroristes pourrait avoir des conséquences bien réelles pour des personnes au Canada, ainsi que leurs amis et leurs familles à l'étranger, notamment ceux et celles qui se battent contre le régime et tout qu'il représente. Cela limiterait la capacité de ces personnes de soutenir leurs amis et leurs familles en Iran. Une personne au Canada pourrait être tenue criminellement responsable d'avoir fait parvenir de l'argent à un proche conscrit au sein du corps des gardiens de la révolution islamique en Iran. Cela pourrait donner lieu rapidement à des actes de représailles de l'Iran envers les forces armées canadiennes, mettant ainsi les soldats canadiens en danger. Les mesures que nous prenons sont concrètes et elles auront un impact. Elles montrent que nous condamnons l'appui du régime iranien au terrorisme et sa mauvaise influence dans leur région. Elles démontrent également notre soutien envers les femmes iraniennes et leurs défenseurs qui continuent de manifester pour faire valoir leurs droits fondamentaux de la personne. Mahsa Amini's death reminds us that the fight for women's freedom is far from over, and we will hold the Iranian regime accountable for Mahsa and for every woman fighting for her freedom. Thank you. Merci.
We will now start the question period. As a reminder, one question and one follow-up. People on the Zoom, I will please use the raise hand function to ask a question. We'll start with Dylan Robertson. Go ahead, Dylan.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. Minister Mendicino, what is your personal view on listing the IRGC as a terrorist group? Should we have done that?
Well, I want to be clear that members of the IRGC are terrorists, are facilitators of human rights violations. And the step that we are taking today is a strong and robust one, where we are not just targeting the IRGC, we are targeting the entirety of the Iranian regime and designating it as a serial violator of human rights and a facilitator of terrorism. And as you heard Minister Lametti explain, using this power under IRPA, which has only been used a handful of times before in the entire history of that particular statute, in places like Rwanda and in Bosnia, where we've seen not only human rights violations, but genocide. It conveys just how serious we take this step. And most importantly, as a result of taking the step of designating the entirety of the regime, we are going to be able to target those who are most responsible within the IRGC and across the entirety of the Iranian regime and ensure that they never step foot in Canada again and ensure that they never use Canada as an avenue for moving assets, moving funding, or in any other way supporting Iran's interests. So I am confident, and our government is confident, that this is the best, most effective option and sanction that we can take right now to ensure that we hold those responsible for all of the transgressions that we have seen. And we are also adding the resources, importantly, as you heard me say earlier today, to ensure that the teeth are necessary to make these sanctions real.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask about the enforcement of some of the stuff against people affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard. We have dozens of people inside Canada. Newsrooms get emails all the time about people. Is there going to be any kind of a hotline for people to report people affiliated with the regime? And also, is there any sort of an appeal for those who feel that they've been caught in a dragnet?
Well, setting up a hotline and operationalizing and materializing the federal funding, which has been allocated, is precisely the work that we are engaged in right now around the clock. And by adding up to 30 new RCMP members and civil servants, we're going to be sure that the resources are necessary to effect and implement these sanctions. We owe it to all of the families of the victims and the survivors of the oppression, the architects of the egregious violations that we've seen, and this is personal. You know, we've been engaging directly with the community. I understand exactly why it is that we need to be motivated to take the actions that are necessary, the ones that we are advancing today. There is no way to convey sufficiently to Canadians the anguish and the loss and the trauma that the community is feeling right now. And one only has to look at the images that we're seeing transmitted from Iran, the courage, the bravery that we are seeing from women of every age across every spectrum, marching for their rights. This is what we mean when we say we see you, we hear you, and we owe it to them to be sure that we're not just using words, that we're not just putting out fanciful rhetoric. This is concrete. This is tangible. And we're putting the money and the resources in place to make sure that these sanctions can be implemented so that we can hold those responsible and at the same time defend human rights here and around the world.
Thank you. Next question, Ashley Berg, CBC.
Hi there. I'm hoping to find out, when it comes to designating the entirety of the Iranian regime under the Immigration and Refugee and Protection Act, what years of the regime will this be for? And specifically, what evidence and examples is the government using for this designation?
Well, I'm happy to take that question for starters, and then we'll pass over the mic to Minister Lametti if he has anything to add. But under the law, under the provision that we're using under IRPA, the threshold for designating a regime is reasonable grounds, which is a flexible legal threshold. And right now, the Canada Border Services Agency is, again, working assiduously to marshal the evidence to ensure that we meet this threshold, as we are confident we will do, given the very obvious and public record when it comes to human rights violations, tortures, killings, transgressions. We are confident about that. But most importantly, as a result of making that designation under IRPA, it will allow us to do some other things, including rendering those most responsible inadmissible. And you've heard me and others cite very large and significant numbers of those who are facilitating the kinds of activities that fall four square within the provision in the range of 10,000. And it will also ensure that Canada cannot be used as a safe haven to move money or to move illegal proceeds and the like. So it's not just that we are designating the entirety of the Iranian regime, it's what it allows us to do in practical and clear terms, which is to ensure that Canada is not a safe haven for anyone that would try to support the Iranian regime's agenda. And obviously, Minister Lametti.
Maybe Minister Fraser.
Okay. All right. Minister Lametti says he has nothing else to add.
Why is the government making this announcement before that work was done, this evidence is collected?
Well, first, I want to be clear that we have been taking decisive action all along. Canada is a global leader when it comes to leading the sanctions campaign against the Iranian regime. We do it domestically. We do it internationally. You heard Minister Ian say that Minister Joly is going to be convening her like-minded ministers in Canada. That's leadership. You heard Minister Ian say that she is in Berlin right now at a G7 conference where she will be advancing women's rights, and I'm sure she will have more to say about that. So we've been acting consistently and decisively all along. I also want to say that in the wake of the PS 752 tragedy a little more than 2 years ago, that we stood with those families, we grieved with those families, we created the pathways, as you heard Minister Fraser say, to allow them to repatriate their bodies so that they could be together at that difficult time. We created new pathways so that those Iranians who lost a loved one on that flight could come to Canada, either temporarily or permanently, should they choose to do so. We did everything, and we will continue to do everything to support those families. They're at the very center of our thoughts and our concerns, and that's what our motivation is to exhaust all efforts to continue to hold those responsible in Iran and to bring them to justice. But I'll perhaps turn it over to Minister Ian to expand.
Thanks so much, Minister Mendicino. So here at the G7 in Berlin, meetings will start in a couple hours from now. And when I mentioned that I would be raising this vigorously, I will. This is about human rights. Iranian women, young and old, are marching. They're risking everything. We've seen images of them ripping off headscarves in the face of the so-called morality police, basically saying it is freedom or it is nothing at all. This is about allyship as well. This is about men and boys marching as well. This is about Canadian Iranians at home who have taken to the streets of our towns, of our cities, demanding the same. My American counterpart here at the G7, I was just with her a little while ago, is Iranian by birth. She moved with her family to Florida when she was 3 years old, just before the regime change. She told me just a little while ago that she is concerned, so concerned about her family, trying to reach her family. And before I came here to be with you and to be with my colleagues, she said, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the sanctions. Thank you for speaking up. And that is being echoed around the world. That is being echoed by other G7 counterparts here. We will be seized with conversations. I will be, as I said, raising this issue. We will have more to say in the coming hours.
Thank you. Next question will be Valérie Gamache from Radio-Canada. Valérie, you can go. Valerie, are you there? We'll go to Stephen Chase. Next question. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question about the money. Can you just give us more detail on the $76 million? Is it going to a particular unit at the RCMP? And is this a one-time $76 million, or is it per year? Or please break it down, how much money and exactly where it's going.
I appreciate the question. And as you pointed out, we've allocated $76 million to ensure that their resources are in place to implement the sanctions with effectiveness. What I can offer you in the way of details today is that this funding will go towards hiring up to 30 new police officers and civil servants. In terms of the unit, what it will be called, how it will be operationalized, those are details that are in the offing, Stephen. But I can tell you that the RCMP and all, colleagues across government are working around the clock to make sure that those boots are on the ground so that we can roll out these sanctions so that they are meaningful. And by that, I mean we can ensure that nobody can come to Canada who would be rendered inadmissible under the provisions that we are using under IRPA, and so that we can do the important forensic work around analyzing how it is that illegal funds or proceeds of crime may be used to, again, facilitate terrorism, to facilitate the transgressions of human rights. And this is complex work. It's work that requires specialty and expertise. And I'm confident the RCMP will stand up the appropriate unit with the appropriate people who possess the appropriate skill set to make sure that those federal funds are actually translating into an effective enforcement regime.
And my follow-up question is, can you give us a commitment that there will be public reporting on how this unit is functioning and its success? Because the RCMP is frankly, pretty much a black box when it comes to that kind of public accountability for initiatives.
Yes.
So you're saying that we'll be able to find out and track how successful they are at enforcing sanctions, gathering assets, how much assets they've gathered, and so on.
I'm saying we'll be transparent about that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll try again with Valérie Gamache from Radio-Canada. Valérie, are you there?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez maintenant?
Can you hear me
Oui,
now?
tout à fait.
Ah, super,
Yes,
bonjour.
Okay.
J'aurais deux petites questions en français.
Well, I have
Premièrement, sur
two
cette
questions
unité,
in
justement,
French
de la GRC.
on this
Est-ce que,
RCMP unit.
en fait, je vais savoir de quoi seront-ils équipés? Donc,
So
quels seront leurs pouvoirs et combien de temps on se donne pour faire tout ce travail-là? Est-ce qu'il y a un timeline là, qui a été établi de se dire, ben, on aimerait ça, par exemple, d'ici le début de l'année, être en mesure d'avoir ramassé tel et tel telle preuve, etc. là.
Donc, tout d'abord, le travail a déjà commencé avec l'ASFC qui sont un des dirigeants de le processus de l'enregistration de l'IRGC et l'application de ce processus vont résulter dans les autorités pour rendre inadmissibles eux qui sont les plus responsables, qui travaillent dans le gouvernement d'Iran. Et peut-être pour quelques autres détails de le processus, je vais passer la parole à la ministre Lametti. Si vous voulez.
Merci. J'ai pas vraiment autres détails à ajouter parce que ça tombe sous la GRC et l'organisation. Mais je souligne ce que le ministre Mendicino vient de dire. C'est sérieux et ça va être un processus qui va nous donner la flexibilité vraiment d'attaquer les personnes qu'on voudrait attaquer et de ne pas attaquer les Canadiens, les Irano-Canadiens qui on ne voudrait pas punir pour être contre le régime, mais qui voudraient appuyer leur famille.
Mais M. Lametti, là-dessus, j'aimerais vous entendre à nouveau dans le sens où j'aimerais que vous expliquiez en français un peu l'explication que vous avez donnée en anglais sur pourquoi vous préférez cette approche-là plutôt que de mettre directement les membres de cette organisation-là sur la liste des organisations terroristes.
Mais ce qu'on a écarté pour l'instant, c'est l'emploi du code criminel. Le code criminel est un outil lourd, est un outil qui n'est pas très flexible, pas très agile. Et donc, en déclarant un organisme comme organisme terroriste, on pourrait englober les personnes qui sont contre le régime, mais qui ont été conscrits dans l'armée, même au passé, ou des Irano-Canadiens qui ont quitté le régime, qui sont contre le régime, mais qui voudraient appuyer leurs membres de leur famille en Iran, qui ont été conscrits eux aussi, ils n'avaient pas de choix. Et donc on ne veut pas punir les personnes qui sont innocentes, effectivement, qui sont contre le régime. Et le code criminel ne nous donne pas cette marge de manœuvre. Et donc, on a employé d'autres outils qui sont très puissants, mais qui sont beaucoup plus ciblés vers le leadership du régime et qui vont fonctionner très, très bien. Nous avons l'appui, certains experts se sont prononcés, comme Thomas Junot. Ils ont dit qu'on avait choisi les meilleurs moyens de procéder. Le code criminel ne l'est pas.
The criminal code will not allow us to do this.
Perfect, thank you. Next question will be Marsha Mortazavi from Iran International TV.
Hello, thank you for taking my questions. I'm asking on behalf of many Iranians who are worried about the people who are already in Canada with ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran and doing money laundering activities and also threatening people with Iranian Canadian backgrounds. So I was wondering if these sanctions will also include the children or immediate families of those individuals who are already placed in the sanction list.
I don't know if Minister Fraser, did you want to comment on that particular question?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And look, this is a very important area that's been flagged for me with those who are already in Canada that have concerns about family members of regime members who are in Canada. It can be a little bit nuanced, but to cut to the point, when someone is deemed inadmissible, as a result of their connection to the regime. Their family members can be deemed inadmissible as well. There are some narrow exceptions to that rule where a family member is traveling on their own who is not complicit with the actions of the regime and is not traveling separately or together with their family member. But it can result in the revocation of status of people who are actually already in Canada that become subject to this status as inadmissibility. The exact process that's followed varies slightly depending on the nature of a person's status as a temporary or permanent resident. But there is the potential for a person who already has status in Canada to have that status revoked, which would require potentially their removal from Canada.
Okay, thank you. And my follow-up question would be in regards with people who are applying to immigrate to Canada with ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran, but they are not listed as the individuals who are put on the sanctions list. They might have their family names changed or whatever way to go around all the sanctions. Is there any way, or is there any organization that is supervising how people can immigrate to Canada with ties to the Islamic Republic?
Perhaps I'll take a first crack at this, but if Minister Mendicino wants to highlight additional elements that CBSA or public safety may have in addition, I think that would be useful. What's important about today's measures is it's not requiring necessarily a list of specific individuals, though there will also be a list of specific individuals through other sanctions that have been put forward. But people who meet the definition of being caught by virtue of their connection to the regime will actually become inadmissible to Canada, whether their specific name is on a list or not. Generally, we work with partners internationally to ensure that the process of screening people for security and admissibility to Canada is robust. We work with a number of international partners, and we use biometrics data that we collect for countries that have a visa requirement that would allow us to scan against a variety of international databases to ensure that the people who we are aware of are in fact not able to come to Canada if they are inadmissible by virtue of this designation of the regime of Iran as a gross perpetrator of human rights violation and terrorism. The execution on the admissibility findings that we do as part of the immigration process can fall to Canada Border Services Agency and Public Safety. For some more detail, perhaps, on the process that would be done internally, I'd be happy to turn to Minister Mendicino.
I think you covered it just fine. Thank you, Sean.
All right, is there any more questions? Dylan Robertson, go ahead.
Hi there. By which date will each of these initiatives come into force?
Well, I will just emphasize again that this is work that is being done tirelessly right across the government. And so our intent is to implement them as quickly as possible. And we've put in place the federal funding to make sure that that happens.
Okay, so I'm not hearing even a ballpark timeline here. So are you withholding the timeline, or do we actually have no working estimate right now?
No, I mean, if pressed, I would tell you that we're not talking about months. I would say certainly within weeks, and we're already putting in place the pieces that are necessary to commence that work. So this is work that is already well in hand, and implementing it and rolling out is going to be our focus. Again, around the clock, including the additional resources which are going to be put in place as a result of the $76 million which we've allocated to ensure that we can hold those who are responsible for these transgressions accountable and to be brought to justice.
Perfect. We'll now go with Julien Guignac from CBC.
Good afternoon. Yeah, thanks for taking my question. This is for David Lametti, please. I'm working on a story that, while different than the subject of today's conference, it affects women and girls in the Yukon, actually. A violent sex offender was almost released on bail in Old Crow on Friday. The Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation has barred Christopher Schaefer from entering its lands. And Schaefer, he's now on bail in Whitehorse after that order was reversed. However, the First Nation has called for a public inquiry into the order to send Schaefer to Old Crow. David, are you aware of this issue, and will you launch an inquiry into the order to send Schaefer to Old Crow?
Yes, I'm aware of the issue. It is an ongoing process, legal process. So I'm obviously not going to comment. I will say that it falls within the discretion of the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, being in the Yukon, to decide whether or not to appeal that ruling. But until that time, until that decision is made, until that time happens, I'm not going to comment publicly on the case. I can't. It's an ongoing matter.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is that the letter was in part addressed to you. So the call for a public inquiry, by virtue of that, pertains to you as well. So you are choosing to decline comment.
Yes, it's an ongoing process. The PPSC is seized of the decision. And they'll have to make a decision. I can't comment on the process.
Thank you. One last question from Ashley Berg, CBC. Go ahead.
Not everyone you sanctioned today is directly implicated in what we're seeing unfold in Iran right now. Like the prosecutor who ordered the torture of an Iranian Canadian journalist 19 years ago. Is that person and others who are being sanctioned because you assume or think that they have assets here in Canada?
Well, first, I want to be clear that the provisions that we're using under IRPA allow us to target those who are most responsible. And far from concluding this work, we have just begun. And as a result, we're going to be able to both name individuals, as you have seen us do under the Special Economic Measures Act, which resides within my colleague, Minister Jolie's authorities, as well as designate, not necessarily by individual name, but rather by category of position and by extension, culpability for the transgressions of human rights violations and other terrorist acts, so that we can be appropriately targeted and ambitious in rendering them inadmissible. And that's how we intend to make sure that Canada cannot be used as a stomping ground for the Iranian regime's interests.
And have you done any sort of assessment of how many IRGC former members or relatives are here in Canada, and what kind of assets they hold, to get a scope of how many people you might be kicking out of the country, or the assets that are here? What can you tell us?
Well, actually, that is precisely the work that is underway right now. And, far from me commenting or any other elected official, those are questions which would be best directed to our police, to our analysts who have the appropriate mandate, remit, and expertise. And certainly, in addition to the powers that we're using under IRPA on inadmissibility, on seizing and freezing assets which could be used to facilitate terrorism or the transgression of human rights, there are also the conventional powers under the criminal code. You've heard David talk a little bit about the listing regime under Section 83 of that particular statute, but there are other charges which can be laid. And certainly if the police are able to marshal a case that is based in admissible evidence, our expectation, as you would imagine, is that those individuals would be brought to justice, whether they are here or abroad. And that's precisely why I want to communicate that we are taking a very serious step today and are going to put in place the resources that are necessary, which can both lead to the enforcement of sanctions as we've rolled them out, but in addition to that, give law enforcement the additional capacity necessary to investigate under the criminal code and other statutes which may be in play.
Perfect. I believe we have a couple more minutes and one last question from Bill Fortier, CTV.
Hi there. The question is for Minister Fraser. Minister Fraser, last night CTV featured the story of Farzana Adel Gadia, a defender of women's rights in Afghanistan who's been denied entry to Canada. Your government continuously says it supports Afghan women and advocates, but we keep seeing examples like this. How do you reconcile that?
So there's a couple different aspects that I think it's important to understand. One, we've created a program that's designed to foster the provision of safe haven and refugee status to women leaders specifically. But we've asked that we are able to launch this initiative in an organized way so we can do the most possible good. We work with referral partners to have people flagged for our program, to have them be validated as someone who is vulnerable, who qualifies for the programs. The individual could potentially qualify under either the government-assisted refugee program or potentially through private sponsorship. And I would encourage groups who are working with this individual to do so. There's some nuances, obviously, with individual case files that we're not permitted to get into for privacy reasons. But should someone qualify on the basis of their status as a woman leader, on the basis of their status as a human rights defender or vulnerability at the hands of the Taliban, I would encourage them to work with the groups to use the process that we've established that will allow us to welcome at least 40,000 Afghan refugees. This is a meaningful initiative, and we're not going to waver on our commitment. And we'd encourage anyone to follow the process that we've established so we can do the most possible good.
And just as a follow-up, it appears her application was assessed in the wrong category. So, and critics are pointing to a backlog of 2 million applications. So you have a backlog, people getting assessed in the category they didn't even apply under. How are you going to fix this system so that it actually is working properly?
So we've advanced a number of measures to reduce the backlog significantly, and it's starting to have a positive impact now, whether that's hiring more than 1,250 new staff, whether it's relaxing certain policy measures to reduce capacity on the system, or whether that's leveraging technology. We are seeing a massive increase in the productive capacity of IRGC are tracking in the right direction. But the issue at hand on the question that you've raised is not a processing capacity issue. You flagged that there was some nuances around which pathway a person was considered for. It's really important that people who are seeking permanent refugee status to come to Canada use the permanent refugee programs that we have established. We have developed them to help women leaders, to help people who are at risk because of their promotion of human rights for others, to be eligible for these programs. We have created opportunities through private sponsorship and through the government-assisted refugee programs. I would urge anyone who's advocating for individuals they believe to qualify to use the programs that we have established for this very specific purpose. It is exactly why we've put them in place. It's going to us to do the most possible good.
Thank you. This is all the time we have today. Thank you, ministers. Let's conclude the press conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.